Okay, so today we're going to look at the process of change by referendum under section 128 of the Commonwealth Constitution. We're going to look at factors that affect the likely success of referendums, and we're also going to look at the way in which one successful referendum changed the division of lawmaking powers. So the referendum is needed in order to change the Constitution. The procedure for a referendum is set out in section 128 of the Constitution. There's only a couple of sections of the Constitution that you need to know by number, and section 128 is one of those. So you need to know that section 128 is the section that sets out the procedure for referendum. You could be asked a question that says, explain the procedure set out by section 128 without the question actually specifically mentioning referendums. It's assumed that you'll know what that means. The referendum procedure is the only way that the actual words of the Constitution can be changed. There's basically three stages to the referendum procedure. Firstly, it goes through the Parliament, then it goes to the people, and finally the referendum goes to the Governor-General. So firstly, through the Parliament, again, section 128 sets out the procedure. A constitutional alteration bill is needed to pass both houses of Parliament, and it passes just the same way as any other bill would pass. It goes through the first reading, second reading, consideration in detail, etc. Or it can actually pass just the one house twice if the Governor-General allows. Once the constitutional alteration bill is passed the Parliament, the proposed change is then put to the people no sooner than 2 months after the bill is passed and no later than 6 months after the bill, and the referendum is put to all eligible voters for the House of Representatives, and it's a simple yes or no vote. To pass a referendum, you need what is known as a double majority. So a majority of voters in all of Australia need to approve the change, and a majority of voters in a majority of states need to approve the change. So 4 out of the 6 states need to approve of the change. If the referendum does receive the double majority, it's then presented to the Governor-General for royal assent, and once the Governor-General has provided royal assent, then the change to the Constitution can be made. And there are a number of factors that affect the likely success of referendums. These include the timing of the referendum, the double majority provision, a lack of bipartisan support, and also voter conservatism. You really should know at least 4 factors that affect the likely success of referendums, because they really help with questions like if you're asked to evaluate the effectiveness of referendums, or if you're asked to analyse the impact of referendum on the division of powers. Firstly, the timing of referendums can affect its likely success. Often referendums are held at the same time as an election in order to save money. And what that means is that voters are likely to be concerned about which party to vote into office, rather than focusing on the referendum being put to them at the same time. It can take the focus away from the referendum, and if voters don't focus on the referendum, then they tend to vote no to it, so it's unlikely to pass. The double majority provision can affect the likely success. It's a very strict requirement, the double majority provision, and that means it's not an easy task to amend the Constitution in order to reflect the will of the voters. In particular, the requirement of a majority of electors in a majority of states is very difficult to satisfy. There can be a lack of bipartisan support for the referendum, particularly if the opposition party is against the proposed changes. Then information from both parties can become confusing. It's almost impossible to pass a referendum without the support of both major parties. Really, you need both major parties to be supportive of the change to the Constitution in order for the referendum to have a chance of success. If one of those parties doesn't support the change, then their supporters will tend to vote against the referendum, and therefore it's unlikely to pass. Voter conservatism is another factor that affects the likely success of referendums. Voters in Australia tend to be quite conservative. They don't like change. They prefer to accept the Constitution as it is, rather than change to something that could have unknown effects. And a really good example was the referendum for Australia to become a republic. A lot of people voted no because they were unsure that the change would really be beneficial. And they also tend to distrust politicians. They distrust their motives for change, and so therefore they tend to vote no, because they're afraid that politicians want the change in order to get more power for themselves. Finally, you do need to know one successful referendum. So there's two that we'll look at today: 1946, the Social Security referendum, and 1967, the Indigenous Australians referendum. So firstly, 1946 Social Security referendum. The focus of this referendum was that prior to this referendum, the only power in the Constitution related to social services was for invalid and old age pensions. And the effect of the referendum, once it was passed, was that it established the rights of the Commonwealth to grant social security payments across a wide variety of areas, and included such things as maternity allowances and unemployment benefits. And the referendum really just clarified the existence of a power that was already being exercised. So the Commonwealth was already granting those payments to people, and the referendum really just confirmed that they had that power within the Constitution. In 1967, the Indigenous Australians referendum was held. The focus of this referendum was to see whether the Commonwealth Parliament should have powers in respect to Indigenous people. Prior to this referendum, the Constitution, all Indigenous issues have been left with the states because they were deemed to have more specialist knowledge in that area. The effect of the referendum was it gave the Commonwealth Parliament the power to legislate for Indigenous people in the states, and it also allowed them to include them in national censuses as well. And that's it.